Augusta, Elizabeth, Louisa and Caroline Matilda. These are the names of George III's sisters. One of them became a German Duchess through her marriage. The other one became Queen of Denmark and Norway. Two of them died tragically young without having the chance to live their life. Their parents were Frederick, the Prince of Wales, and Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. Frederick died suddenly in 1751 at the age of 44 before ever becoming king and before the birth of his youngest daughter. In today's video, we will meet each of them individually, starting off with the eldest of them, Augusta. Princess Augusta Frederica of Great Britain was born in 1737 as the first child of Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha and Frederick the Prince of Wales. Born a year after her parents' wedding, the young princess was the first grandchild to King George II. In 1761, when Augusta was 24, we find the first mentioning of her for being a suitable bride for Charles William Ferdinand, the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, and her second cousin. But as her mother Augusta disliked the House of Brunswick, marriage negotiations were delayed. Lastly, in January 1764, Augusta and Charles married at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace. The newlywed couple left London for Brunswick later in January from the port in Harwich. Shortly after arriving at the court of her husband, Charles had Castle Richmond built for Augusta. The castle was designed in an English style for Augusta to remind her of her home country. Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel was a rather small state within the Holy Roman Empire. Charles was the firstborn son of his parents and a nephew of Frederick the Great. The couple's firstborn child was born in December of that same year. 6 more children would follow within the next 8 years. But despite Augusta and Charles being, you could almost say, distantly related as second cousins, 3 of their 7 children were born with disabilities. This left many to assume that inbreeding might be the fault for their children's disabilities. Augusta and Charles enjoyed a happy marriage at the beginning, despite it being arranged. Despite her husband's efforts to make Augusta feel like home in his duchy, the Duchess never fully adapted to her new home country. She was described by the people around her as being English through and through. While pregnant with her second child, Augusta and Charles returned to London for the first time since their wedding. There they were received by cheering crowds on the street. This caused Augusta's sister-in-law, Queen Charlotte, to refuse the couple some honors at court. The negative tension from this visit would hold on for the rest of their lives. Back in Brunswick, Augusta was confronted with her dull and boring mother-in-law. She would therefore spend much of her time at Castle Richmond, where she would play cards, gossip, and receive many visitors from England. When her mother died in 1772, Augusta was at her side. On returning back to Brunswick, she extended the mourning period leading to her retirement from participation of court life. When in 1777 her husband Charles decided to install his mistress as the royal mistress at his court, Augusta announced her final retirement from court life. The couple's second eldest daughter, Caroline, was wed to her first cousin, the later King George IV. The marriage, however, was unhappy and only resulted in one child, Princess Charlotte of Wales. During the Napoleonic Wars, Charles, by then 71, was installed as commander-in-chief of the Prussian army. At the Battle of Auerstedt, Charles was seriously wounded and died a few days later. Augusta was forced to flee from the advancing French army and was forced to live with her relatives for the next few years. In 1807, her brother, by then George III, allowed her to return back to London. Augusta lived out the remainder of her days in her home country until she died in 1813 at the age of 75. Augusta's younger sister was Princess Elizabeth of Great Britain. Born on January 10, 1741, Princess Elizabeth Caroline was the fourth child to her parents. 25 days after her birth, she was christened at Norfolk House, which is also her birthplace. Elizabeth suffered from weak health all of her life. She therefore never received a proper education and never learned how to read. In a letter from Horace Walpole, a Whig politician during Georgian England, we find one of the only few surviving mentionings of Elizabeth. Horace describes how he saw Elizabeth act in a play at the age of 8. She was so weak that she barely could stand alone, but acted better than all of her siblings. She learned her part by just listening to the others studying their part. Sadly, Elizabeth died on September 4, 1759, at the age of only 18 of inflammation in her bowels. She never married and never had any children. Elizabeth is buried inside Westminster Abbey. Tragically, this is all the information we know on her way to short life. Elizabeth's younger sister was Princess Louisa of Great Britain. Louisa Anne was born on March 19, 1749 at Leicester House. Just like with her elder sister Elizabeth, Louise also suffered from bad health from a young age on. In 1764, first negotiations were made on a possible marriage between Louisa and the heir to the throne of Denmark and Norway. Louisa was considered an excellent bride as there were only a few Protestant unmarried princesses available at that time. But when the Danish representative learned of Louisa's weak condition, he chose her younger sister as bride instead. That same year, she received a marriage proposal from her brother George's brother-in-law, Adolf Frederick of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. But these negotiations also came to an end due to her bad health. After years of declining health, Louisa died at the age of only 19 in 1768. She was also buried inside of Westminster Abbey. Louisa's younger sister was Caroline Matilda. She was born on July 22, 1751, as the youngest and posthumous child of her father. She grew up with all of her siblings at Leicester House, where her mother devoted her time towards the children. Caroline was temperamental, enjoyed the outdoors, and loved riding. The young princess was described as a talented musician and a great singer. She loved to read and spoke 4 languages: English, Italian, French, and German. When in 1764 her elder sister Louisa was too weak for marriage, Caroline Matilda was chosen as bride for her first cousin and heir to the Danish-Norwegian throne, Christian. And so, at the age of only 13 and without her knowledge, Caroline Matilda was engaged to the crown prince. During the wedding preparations in 1766, Crown Prince Christian's father suddenly died and he therefore became Christian VII. A few months later, Caroline Matilda and Christian were married by proxy. The young bride left her home country for Denmark 2 days later. After a journey of 12 days, she arrived in Denmark and saw her husband for the first time. There they were married for a second time, and Caroline Matilda therefore became Queen Consort of Denmark and Norway. Despite her once warm welcome to the Danish court, the young queen did not get popular there. Further, her husband treated her coldly and was more interested in his mistress. After being persuaded, the mentally ill Christian VII consummated his marriage, and Caroline Matilda gave birth to their only child and heir in January 1768. That same year, Christian VII went on a long tour through Europe. During this time, the lonely queen caused scandals by walking around Copenhagen with her son. At that time, royal women would only travel by carriage around town. In addition, she made herself friends with some women known for their many love affairs. Caroline Matilda's husband returned in 1769 with Johann Friedrich Struensee, whom he installed as his personal physician. Struensee tried to cure the king's mental illness by restoring the relationship with his wife. Christian VII therefore set up a 3-day birthday celebration for his wife that year. Caroline Matilda was aware that Struensee was behind these plans and therefore showed her gratitude towards him. By the spring of September 1770, the Queen and Struensee had become lovers. These rumors quickly spread even outside of the court. With the king's mental illness getting worse, he gave more and more of his daily state affairs over to Struensee. That same year, Struensee became Privy Councillor, and between 1771 and 1772 he held absolute sway. This period later became known as the Time of Struensee. Caroline Matilda supported Struensee's many reforms and therefore also shared his unpopularity. In 1771, Caroline Matilda gave birth to a second child, a daughter who, although recognized by the king, most likely was Struensee's daughter. The unpopularity of the couple rose throughout the year, and soon rumors of a possible plot against them began to spread. During the night from January 16th to January 17th, Struensee and Caroline Matilda were arrested. Eventually, Struensee was executed, while the marriage of the king and queen was divorced. With the help of her brother, King George III, it was agreed that Caroline Matilda should live in exile in Celle. She had to leave both of her children in Copenhagen and never saw them again. In Celle, Caroline Matilda lived a quiet life. She was visited by her elder sister Augusta a few times and was known for her generosity towards orphaned children. The once Queen of Denmark and Norway died there suddenly in 1775 of scarlet fever. Now, with all that happened in Caroline Matilda's life, it seems like she lived a quite long life, but when she died, she was only 23.